Okay.
Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to Democracy, or sorry, I should say Ancient Modern. I almost said Democracy Ancient Modern. Just call it Ancient Modern, this podcast. And today we have a very special guest who is Josiah Ober, Professor of Classics and Political Science at Stanford. He has been a mentor to many classicists, including myself. And he's the author of, well, more than a few books, but the ones we want to talk about today, I think, are this great trilogy of books about democratic Athens. And we'll get to those in just a moment. I have the big pile of 3 books here. But Josh, I wanted to start out because I know that you originally you weren't a scholar of democracy. You were a scholar of Athenian military history. And I know you tramped around the Attic countryside and camped out, and you published a few old fortification towers, and you were very interested in the walls and the towers in Attica. So can you talk a little bit about what you were doing then, and how did you make the transition from working on that to working on Athenian democracy?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, James, and very happy to be having this conversation. So yeah, my PhD dissertation was on the defense of Athens, the defensive system of Athens after the Peloponnesian War. This was really inspired by the Vietnam era questions that were very much in our minds at that point. We're talking about now the mid to late 1970s. And I was very interested in the question of what happens to a democratic society when it loses a big war. And Athens obviously lost a big war. The United States had lost a much less consequential to the United States war, and it seemed something worth investigating. So it fairly quickly became clear that in order to really do the work on this, I had to not only investigate the economic background, how did the Athenian economy change after the Peloponnesian War, such that protecting local resources was a more important issue, and general attitudes towards, was it a terrible thing that we gave up our sacred countryside during that war and lost the war anyway. There also was a matter of the response in terms of the material infrastructure. So what did they actually do in terms of building things that were different than they would have built otherwise, especially in terms of how they were protecting the countryside. So it had this big archaeological component, which became quite central to what I was doing. Meaning that my wife Adrian and I got to tramp around the Greek countryside for some time, looking for fortified sites, recording them, and trying to make sense of the basically military infrastructure of the Athenian countryside, especially the way it changed between the 5th and the 4th centuries. So I thought that was what I'd probably do for the rest of my career. And published some work on it. But then there was a change in the Greek government, which made doing the kind of field work I was engaged in much more difficult. That it became virtually impossible to get permits for doing the kind of thing I was doing. And so I had to go to Plan B. Plan B was a note card that I had scratched a note on back when I was working on my dissertation. And the note card said something like, think about elitism and anti-elitism in Athenian rhetoric, because I noticed there were these sort of odd contradictions, or what seemed like odd contradictions in some speeches by Athenian orators. So since I needed to try to get tenure at that point, and I figured I wasn't going to get it if I was basing my career on archaeological field work that I couldn't do, Plan B looked pretty good because it was all library work. And so that's why I turned to the book that eventually became Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens.
Right, great. So that's a perfect segue. So let's turn to this book, Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens, the first book on my pile. So this is really essentially, it's a study of oratory, right? Or it's a study of the the remains of speeches that we have from law courts and other institutions within Athens. So Demosthenes, Lysias, people like that. But it's not really a kind of conventional rhetorical study of those texts. What was it in particular that you were trying to do with your study of those texts in this book?
Yeah, so I got interested in Greek oratory when I was still a graduate student. That's why I had that note card back in the day. What it seemed to me is that the work that had been done at that point on Greek rhetoric was sort of missing the point. There was lots of interesting work on the rhetorical tropes and thinking about speeches in their literary sense. And there was a lot of kind of historical nugget mining, trying to take bits out of the speeches that were relevant to reconstructing the actual events of the period, which is all very useful and helpful and a good foundation for what I was doing. But it seemed that what were these speeches doing was not really, and especially what were they doing if you think of them as a corpus rather than just speech by speech, seemed to be missed. So basically, I thought, well, what's going on in a speech? Well, it's an individual talking to a large audience in a democracy. The individual almost invariably being a member of the Athenian elite, one way and another, elite of wealth, elite of education. It's talking to a bunch of people, citizens, either in an assembly or in a law court, who were, for the most part, not elite, and trying to communicate to them something that was rather important to the speaker, either trying to persuade them to vote on a particular item, or in the case of the more numerous court speeches, persuade them to vote a certain way on a legal question, highly salient legal question for the defendant or prosecutor in a courtroom. And so in order to make their argument, make this go through, I thought it seemed at least intuitive that the speaker is going to have to take into account some of the attitudes of the audience. This seemed to be what Aristotle was saying in his Art of Rhetoric, or at least some passages in the Art of Rhetoric. And so conceived then of the body of speeches that we had as at least fragments of a two-way conversation between Athenian elites and their mass audiences about things that were important to both sides. On the one hand, about the role for elites, in some cases a leadership role for elites. On the other hand, the mass audience that was very eager to avoid capture of the democratic system by elites, and was both recognized the necessity of elite leadership in certain areas, but was very nervous about the likelihood that unconstrained elites would capture the system for their own advantage. And so the body of these speeches, I thought, and I argued, could be used to look at the way in which the two-way communication, the response of the audience to the speakers and the response of the speakers to the audience could be a way to try to get at how the discourse of democracy actually worked, and ultimately argued that the discourse of democracy had a lot to do with why democracy succeeded in Athens, because a vocabulary was developed in which elites and masses could talk to each other, and that vocabulary, that even the grammar of that conversation was ultimately, I suggested, controlled by the audience rather than by the speaker, because the speaker was, in the end, completely dependent on the audience to achieve the ends they were trying to achieve, that is, the vote. And so that seemed to me to be then a way to explain the puzzle, or at least a first take on explaining the puzzle of, as my dissertation advisor once posed it to me, why is it that a democratic city-state survived more than 20 minutes?
Right. Well, I mean, that was the challenge, wasn't it? Well, not only did it survive for more than 20 minutes, but it seems like you're arguing that, contrary to what a lot of people used to say, it was genuinely democracy, right? Because that's the point of what you're saying about discourse, that it's really the demos, the people of Athens, who are in the driving seat. There is an elite in Athens. There is a social and economic elite, but it doesn't seem to control the discourse. And we'll get on to the fact that they don't seem to control the institutions either. But I just wanted to add one thing in. I mean, I know that you were also inspired, if that's the right word, by Robert Michels, this the German-Italian sociologist, who had this theory, you know, the iron law of oligarchy. And he studied socialist movements and I think the church as well. And his theory was that however egalitarian an organization is, it always sort of slides towards oligarchy because there are always people who emerge to be the leaders. And it's very difficult to maintain democracy, true democracy, for any length of time. So that was something you were taking aim at in this book as well, right?
Yeah, when I started digging into this, I realized how influential Michels' iron law of oligarchy really was, not only in sociological studies or political sociology, but also in the field of classics. So if we think about the work of the great Roman historian Ronald Syme, in some ways, one of the most influential historians of the 20th century. And
a graduate of Victoria University, may I add.
There you have it. A plug. So Syme, in the preface to that work, doesn't directly cite Michels, but he basically restates the iron law, says that behind every form of government, whether it's ostensibly a democracy or ostensibly a monarchy, there is always an oligarchy, and that the job of the historian is to excavate that archaeology, which is there. It will be found. So it's one of the strongest statements of historical methodology I know of, which is amusing because Syme is often thought or cited by the sort of older school historians of my early years who were claimed to be completely hostile to all forms of methodology or theory. Well, here Syme is using one of the fundamental theories about social organization, this iron law, and just claiming that it's the job of the historian is to simply rediscover the iron law wherever, in whatever society you happen to be studying. At any rate, I thought that Athens was at least potentially a way to challenge that, and that it is not the case that every society is actually an oligarchy. That really does change the whole way we think about the potential for a human social organization. If you accept the iron law really is an iron law, then it's going to be a very different thing from if you think that oligarchy is one tendency that needs to be guarded against in a democracy, but it is not an inevitability.
Right. Yeah. Syme, I think, said of the Roman Constitution that it was a screen and a sham, which actually, when it comes to the Roman Constitution, I don't know if I completely disagree with that. Well, after a certain point, it's obviously a screen and a sham, and once you get into the empire. But okay, so let's move on now, because there were also people around in Athens as mostly part of this cultural and economic elite who also thought that the Athenian constitution was kind of a sham. Maybe not in the sense that it wasn't genuinely democracy. I think that one of their problems with it was that they thought it was a genuine democracy. But I'm talking about, of course, the sort of what you call the company of critics of Athenian democracy. And this is the subject of this book, Political Dissent in Democratic Athens. So I remember reading the intro or the preface of this book, and you talk about how at various points in this study of many different critics of the Athenian democracy, certain figures threatened to take over. It almost just became a book about Plato. I think it almost just became a book about Thucydides. So why do this? Because it kind of, I think at the time it probably ran up against some fairly sort of well-established norms and classics that you're really just meant to go deep into one author. So why sort of go crazy and do, how many of them are there in this book? 6 or 7, right? Why do 6 or 7 at the same time?
Yeah, so it really was when I finished the Mass and Elite book, maybe before it was even published, I'd realized that I'd really only started the project. Every time you start on a book, you think, okay, this is it. I've now solved the problem. But by the time you get to the end of the book, you realize, actually you've only begun to address the problem. So the basic question then is, if the story is right, that there was a sort of hegemonic tendency in public discourse, and the hegemony was really held by the masses rather than by the elites, so sort of turning Antonio Gramsci's argument of cultural hegemony on its head. Then that left open the question of, well, how is criticism possible? And then if you think about the work that we have from antiquity, a lot of it is overtly critical of democracy. So the idea that hegemony simply made criticism of this democratic system impossible is confounded on the face of it by the literary record. So the question then is, what is the relationship between critical discourse and democracy? So the first thought there was that the democracy offers a challenge to critics, a challenge to, I should say, elite intellectuals that really only exists when a democracy is real. If you think about a society in which the so-called iron law is actually operative, then elites are running the thing. And there's no need for them to think very deeply about politics in an intellectual sense. They think about how to compete with other elites about who's actually running it. But you don't really need to think very hard about what it is that we're doing in politics, because after all, we're just doing what comes naturally to the ruling class. But if the natural ruling class, in the minds of the aristocrats, is actually not running the show, and if the ordinary people are running the show, and they are actually doing it pretty well in terms of at least the polis is holding together, win some wars, you lose some wars, but overall the system seems to be performing. And performing perhaps even better than the oligarchic alternatives, as Plato had to admit after his relatives took over the government of Athens briefly at the end of the Peloponnesian War and made a total mess of things. And so you sort of have to then scratch your head and say, well, at least the Democrats didn't make that bad of a mess of things. So if you can't just say, well, democracy is simply impossible, per Robert Michels. And if you can't say, well, it's certainly the case that our people would run things better if we were running things, then what are you going to say? And ultimately, I think that pushes then elites into a position, intellectual elites, people like Plato or Thucydides, into a position of having to really think much more deeply about what is the nature of politics and what alternatives are there to the rule of the people. So that's sort of the logic of this book. But I realized, much like the Mass and Elite book, which was meant to not study a particular speaker, but a mass of speeches, that I really had to make the argument not just on the basis of an intellectual, because if you just do just Plato or just Thucydides, you have special features, special considerations that can't be explained by a general relationship between criticism and democracy. You really have to cover the waterfront to an extent and say that there are themes that are running through a range of speakers, or a range of writers, rather, who are different in many ways. So Thucydides ostensibly writing history, Plato, Aristotle ostensibly writing moral philosophy, people like Aristophanes writing comedies, people like Isocrates writing these kind of speeches intended for circulation rather than actual performance. You have a range of these writers who seem to be engaged in a debate among themselves, but with a set of concerns that are common to that company or that community of critical writers. And the only way you're going to really make that argument is to go deep enough into each of these authors and then show the commonalities among them, and then show the ways in which each writer seems to be picking up themes and seeking to do better than other writers within this, broadly speaking, critical community. So they have a common set of concerns about which they're competing for the best answer.
Right. And there are differences, as you say. I mean, the figure we know as the old oligarch sort of says, I don't really like democracy, but they do it well, and that's kind of all he gets to. But of course, there's some more impressive thinkers in this bunch, Thucydides and Plato. And I guess one of the themes that they are looking at a lot is this idea of knowledge, or we might even say rationality. And I guess that's really ultimately Plato's critique of democracy, that he thinks that politics should be some kind of form of expertise, and you can train people up to have that form of expertise, which really ultimately, I guess, depends on being an ethical expert more than a political expert. But once you get the ethics right, or even the metaphysics right, and you can see the form of the good, you can understand what the good is, capital G, then you can do politics well. So yeah, do you want to talk about that for a while? So, because it seems like the idea that democracies can't really do knowledge or expertise right is at the core of some of these thinkers' critiques.
Yeah, that's exactly so. I mean, certainly the notion that they are not rational in the right way, maybe not rational at all, and certainly incapable of the kind of expertise, the kind of political expertise, the kind of technical political expertise that would be necessary to create a morally valuable community, is really at the core of the argument that I think certainly that Plato makes. Aristotle picks up on this in a different kind of way. Earlier writers, Thucydides, I think, isn't as concerned with the achievement of a morally good or even acceptable community, but he is once again very concerned with the lack of expertise. Thinks that Pericles has a certain kind of political expertise. He both has a capacity to figure out the likely course of events based on an assessment of probability, and also has the rhetorical expertise to be able to control the audience rather than be controlled by it. That's a theme that runs through a lot of this writing. And so, yeah, their argument is ultimately that that really is the core problem with democracy, is that it really lacks the capacity to identify the right kind of experts and to use that expertise in order to gain the relevant ends, whether those ends are material ends, security, welfare, or whether those ends are moral ends, that an ethical community.
Yeah, and Thucydides seems to think that the institutions are just all wrong, because you've got all these people in the assembly, a lot of them aren't very well educated, and you say, shall we invade Sicily? Something crazy like that, and then the ball starts rolling, and once it starts rolling, the snowball becomes an avalanche. And they can't, even if, wiser, older heads like Nicias stand up and say, we can't do this, or if we're going to do this, we've got to go really big. The Athenian assembly then sort of says, great, let's do it. Let's go really big, because they're also sort of riled up. So I guess for Plato, it's quite an intellectualist view, although he definitely has his own ideas about what institutions should be like. Weird ideas about what institutions, fascinating ideas about what institutions should be like. Thucydides also, I think, has this more implicit critique of institutions. So, okay, so you've got these critiques of institutions and of the idea that democracies can aggregate knowledge. And now we have your next book, which I guess takes this head on. So Democracy and Knowledge, Innovation and Learning in Classical Athens. So this is really an attempt to show that, contrary to what Plato and Thucydides were implying or even saying outright, Athens is kind of I mean, maybe it's too much to say it's a model, but it kind of exemplifies and illustrates the ways in which democratic institutions can actually aggregate knowledge and create some kind of rationality.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I realized, once again at the end of the second book in this trilogy, the book on critics of democracy, that I really didn't have the final answer about how is it that the democracy answered those particular concerns. I talked about the control of discourse, that is, you can keep elites from capturing the system, and you can have the relationship between a democratic society and its critics that generates a lot of high-end and very deep and very thoughtful criticism. But ultimately, I didn't know how to answer that criticism. I didn't really have the story about how is it that Athens does achieve its ends, its material ends of at least security, welfare in a highly competitive Greek world. So I really struggled with this one. This third book gave me fits. I had it sort of half written at one point, based on some preliminary ideas that were pretty much being generated off of the thinking that went into the first two books. But I really I wasn't satisfied with it. About at that point when I have it half written and think I've got to go somewhere with this, I was lucky enough to have a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford. This is before I joined the faculty at Stanford. I was still at Princeton at the time. Got to this center, ran my preliminary ideas by some of the social scientists both at the Research Center and at Stanford Political Science Department, and people basically said, "Well, that doesn't make much sense." Which I felt very discouraged by. I thought, well, I'm a serious Greek historian. You're supposed to say, well, we're going to tweak the idea a little bit, but no, I just sort of said that really you're off on the wrong foot. And I realized pretty quickly I really was, and I really was because I hadn't really thought seriously enough about the ways in which various democratic institutions, in fact, could be understood using the right sort of analytic tools as having the potential to, even if not designed initially to, but having the potential to aggregate and align and carry out in a formal, codified sort of way, the background knowledge of a large, diverse community like that of the Athenian citizenry. So it really took me into an institutionalist turn, which my earlier two books really hadn't engaged with very much.
Okay, so maybe let's try and give people who haven't yet read the book an idea of what you mean by some of these mechanisms. So you talked about aggregation. So what's going on there? So there are people around Athens, and I guess they all have their different little local knowledges of what's going on. Maybe I live in a seaside town and I know about the fishing, or I can build. I've helped out building a ship, and there's someone who lives in the center of Athens, and they know about building work. So what happens how does the Athenian system help to kind of bring those little tidbits of knowledge together?
Yeah, so the basic idea, and I got this through doing some work on theories of organizations, including business organizations, but organizations of various sorts. And it turns out that, at least according to lots of organizational theory, the big problem that any large, complex organization has is how to make use of that which is known by the many individuals who make up the organization in an effective manner. So the assumption is that we collectively know much more than any one of us actually knows, or any few of us actually knows, because we each have some special knowledge of particular processes or particular information or particular skill sets, particular experiences that are ultimately, potentially, relevant for solving various problems that we collectively as the organization need to be able to address. The trick is, how do you actually get that stuff to work together? The problem is like a big mass of data, right? I mean, this is a problem that people work on currently, right? You've got lots and lots and lots of data. How do you organize it in a way so that it actually answers a question you want to ask? And that's not a simple matter. It's really you both have to deal with the problem of how do you get out of people's heads what they have in their heads. Why don't people just protect their proprietary knowledge? They say, well, actually, no, my knowledge is valuable. It's intellectual property. I'm not going to make it public just because. And then how do you decide, well, what bits of knowledge are actually relevant for the particular problem we have to deal with now? And that's not all the data that's out there. It's just some bits. And how do you do all of this in a timely way so that you actually can address a problem before the problem beats you, right? So, and so I think that's really a matter of institutions that are designed in a certain way. So part of the book was really to look at how certain particular features of the Athenian democracy, especially the Council of 500, a council of citizens that was chosen by random selection through a lottery and aimed at, for the reasons of the original developer of this institution, to try to mix together all of the people from the diverse parts of Athens, probably at that point simply trying to create national cohesion, trying to break down the kind of local regionalism that made it difficult for Athens to do anything as a cohesive state. But as the economists would say, a positive externality of this mixing together of a randomly chosen group of citizens in the council on a given year, you had a selection of citizens who know quite a lot about what Athens knows. Then the organization of the council, which is largely structured, or structures a lot of the work through, in a sense, subcommittees of the whole, groups of 50 of these counselors, each group of 50 also internally diverse by design. And they're now down to a small enough group that has to work together for a year and has quite high incentives to, in fact, solve problems. A small enough group of men who come to know each other quite well, who have understanding that if they do their job well, they will be in various ways, at least in reputational ways, rewarded by their fellow citizens, and that if they fail, there will be really serious consequences, not only for the state as a whole, but for themselves. And so you basically overcome these problems of people being unwilling to say what's in their head, because they actually begin to have some incentives to say what's in their head. They have incentives to talk with people from different walks of life in an attempt to solve problems. And because you get to know each other, you know who knows what, you know who's trustworthy on what, you begin to have a capacity to sort out the information relevant to the problem that we're trying to deal with, whether it's, do we or don't we raise the payments to the orphans this year, or do we or don't we go to war with Sparta, or how many ships should we build and send to a given a theater of war. This then becomes a process then of potentially aggregating a lot of the information that is known across the community in a particular institutional locus, which is specifically designed and meant to give advice to the larger citizen assembly. The larger citizen assembly then bringing in even larger, potentially catchment of knowledge. But now they can start in an assembly meeting with a recommendation from the council that has already tried to aggregate a lot of what we collectively know, organize it to an answer to a particular problem. And this means that assembly discussions can simply add something to that. There may be something that the council doesn't know, but at least you have a place to start. And so the system then can effectively aggregate more of what is known. And then the process of decision-making in the assembly is aimed specifically at the difficult problem of deciding, well, what should we really do? What will be the actual proposal, and trying to push towards something that at least can approach a quasi-consensus on, yes, this is what we can do. This is the best we can do. We brought together as much as we can know in the time we have to know it. This is the best answer we can have, and we go ahead and that becomes policy. So instead of just being a way to aggregate diverse preferences, which is often the way we think about democracy, I want guns, you want butter. It becomes a way to aggregate knowledge for problem solving, and that was sort of the breakthrough idea. That's why does Athens work? Because it actually it actually works effectively for institutionally specifiable reasons based on the incentives that individuals have to share what they know and to do it in an effective way. And this then solves the puzzle of why Athens turns out to be a relatively effective organization.
Right. But it still seems to me it's sort of continuous with this more utilitarian view of preference aggregation, which is the idea, that you just get what people want. As you say, I like guns, you like butter, I like vanilla ice cream, and then you kind of build it up. And I know you quote Hayek at a few points in your book. I mean, one of Hayek's big things, of course, was the price mechanism, the idea that there's information out there about what people want, and the best way of aggregating that and sort of diffusing it around society is the mechanism of price. Now you have something similar going on because you're aggregating knowledge. You're doing it in a more statist way, which is fine. I mean, maybe Hayek wouldn't have been fine with it, but that seems to me to be what the Athenians were doing. They're aggregating knowledge in this way. So what we have here, I guess, is it's a way of getting knowledge about the world out there. In the world here, it's sort of people's minds. So, I want something. I'm living in Sunion, and I go to the assembly and I say, I would like this to happen. And everyone else, or the male citizens in Athens can do the same thing. And now it seems to me that we come to this problem. We're also in a democracy, and we have, there's a strong element of majority rule. And as Thucydides like to point out, there are also all of these mechanisms, these cascades that occur. So you can actually be in the assembly, and it may be, for example, that there's somebody in the assembly like Nicias who actually knows a thing or two about Syracuse and Sicily and how far away they are. And so you have all these people signaling, my preference, my information is that this is a fantastic idea to launch this, this armada to Sicily. And then you get to the point where somebody else says, well, I have a bit of knowledge too. And it just gets overwhelmed. And at that point, it seems also, I don't think Thucydides says this directly, but we can assume, I think, that there were probably people in the assembly meeting sitting there kind of scratching their heads saying, yeah, I'm not sure this is a good idea either. But there's a lot of hubbub in the assembly. There's this therubos, everybody's putting their hands up, and I'm not gonna, I can see them putting their hands up. I know there's like 5,000 people putting their hands up to say, let's go to Sicily. I'm not gonna be the guy who puts his hand up to say, let's not go to Sicily. So, so then I guess this is kind of a very complicated segue to another topic, which is sort of democracy and liberalism. Is there actually a tension here? Because you have these strong sort of majoritarian, and this is something, of course, that lots of people have worried about, you know, the American founders, etc. So you have these strong sort of majoritarian impulses, which are kind of necessary in democracy. But then you also want to, you also have to have, people have to have the ability to actually signal their true preferences if the democratic system is to work, right? So I know you worked on, in your book, Demopolis, you worked on the relationship between these two things, liberalism and democracy. So I'll just throw all that at you and see how you respond.
Yeah, so I think, so this Demopolis, which the subtitle was Democracy Before Liberalism, was really meant as a contribution, not in the first instance to Greek history, but to democratic theory, but it did in fact build on the work I've been doing for a long time on Athens and on Greek democracies generally. So the basic idea in that book is that it's important to analytically separate democracy as collective self-governance from liberalism as a commitment to rights of various sorts. I mean, in a simple sense, or to justice in some sense. So that the question that democracy as such, self-government has to ask or has to answer is how is it that a collectivity can form coherent preferences, gain knowledge about the world relevant to the pursuit of these coherently formed preferences, and then act accordingly. And that's a collective action problem, right? And then collective action problems are really complicated. They're complicated because of preference diversity. It's not the case that the collective comes to into the world all having just the same set of preferences on a whole range of things. On the other hand, if you have complete preference diversity all the way down, it's not possible that this collectivity is going to actually be able to form the kind of rational decisions, that is, having preferences and putting knowledge about the world to work in satisfying those preferences and acting accordingly. So the basic idea is that for a democracy to work, there has to be an agreement on some very basic preferences. And the very basic preferences that I suggested that every working political organization has to answer, any kind of constitutional order has to answer, is how do you give people the thing that I think pretty much everybody wants, basic security, so that people aren't living in fear all the time, either of fear of one another or fear of, pause. So the idea that that every kind of political organization has to answer, how do you create conditions of basic security, and how do you create conditions of basic material welfare? So this is basically the question that Thomas Hobbes asks in the middle of the 17th century in the great work Leviathan. And his argument is that in a state of nature, in a state of political disorganization, life is miserable because you don't have any capacity to gain either baseline security or baseline welfare, and therefore you need some kind of a social organization, and he has an answer to that. It's going to be some very strong central government. But the Democrat then has to add to that baseline security plus welfare a third shared preference, and that is not to have a boss, not to have an individual or a small junta running the show. The Democrat says self-government is necessary because I don't want to be run by a boss. And I take these as basically primitive preferences. You don't have to really explain where they come from. Just if you have people who want to create a democracy, they've at least decided on those three things. And then the question of how do you achieve self-government, which is the only alternative to having a boss. If we're not going to have somebody run us, we have to run ourselves. We have to be our own boss. We are the collective boss over ourselves. We set the rules and we enforce the rules and we interpret the rules ourselves rather than having this happen from the outside, as Hobbes thought it had to happen. And so that becomes very challenging, and it takes various conditions in place for that to happen. Some of those conditions are, I think, arguably the conditions that are familiar to people who are committed to liberalism. So free speech, freedom of association, baseline equality of political influence. These, I think, are basic conditions without which you can't have anything really like self-government, because if there's somebody who is telling me what I can say, what I can contribute to, the problem solving that needs to go on. If somebody is telling me who I can associate with and who I can't associate with legitimately, if someone is telling me that, well, it's all very fine and well, but you say, but this other person's choice is going to always trump yours because, they get, 1,000 votes to your one vote. If we don't have baseline liberty and equality of these sorts, then it's not truly self-government. So democracy requires these kinds of conditions that are very strongly associated in liberalism. But basic democracy, I think, treats these, at least in the first instance, as conditions rather than as values. So liberalism says they're values. You should want to be free. You should want to be equal. These are, or this is in some sense, a metaphysical condition. You are free and you ought to express that in your life. You are equal and you should express that in the political organization. The Democrat doesn't have to be committed to that sort of metaphysical story. They can simply say, well, if we don't act as if we are free and equal, then there's going to be a boss. And by stipulation, we don't want a boss. So what I want to say is that democracy does indeed overlap with some traditional commitments of liberalism, but not with all of them, and not for always the same reason. This is not meant to be a challenge to liberalism. It's not saying that democracy would be the better way to go, democracy without liberalism, or worse yet, illiberal democracy. We're not saying that's the better way to go. Simply that we should analytically keep the two separate and recognize that democracy can be an effective platform for a variety of kinds of regimes, some of which are strongly liberal and some of which might not be.
Right. So so free speech is, for example, is almost like an initial setting for a democracy app. If you don't put free speech into the democracy app, then when people try and use it, it'll kind of break down. It'll get buggy. I think that's the idea.
Yeah.
And so so shifting to, I'll let you go in about 10 minutes. We're about 15 minutes away from the hour, but maybe we should shift to some more modern concerns, because I know you've had a very distinguished career of thinking about Athenian democracy, but you also have, like any citizen, you have thoughts about the world that you live in as well.
Yeah.
So let's just take it back to Thucydides' description of the assembly when the Athenians launched what turned out to be a disastrous expedition to Sicily. So as I was trying to say, I mean, this follows your reading. It looks like he's describing a kind of cascade where, you know, one person says this is a good idea and the ball starts rolling, and after that point it's really hard to sort of stop it rolling. And it seems to me that nowadays we can see this kind of thing happening in real time just by opening Twitter or some equivalent social media. And, you know, some of them seem to be positive cascades. And when it first started, everybody said, this is great. You can go on and say, I'm raising money for Alzheimer's research or whatever it is, and people will get on board. That's great. Social causes. And then, it started to get a bit dark. And I don't want to exaggerate. There probably still are positive things happening, but a lot of people have seen that there are also these mobbings and it's happening on both sides. I guess the fringes on the far left and the far right. I think some people have a more sort of traditional outlook. They've looked at this and said, well, look, this is what you get with democracy. All these people online and they just go crazy. So is Thucydides' critique vindicated in the modern world?
Right. So I think that if the Athenian assembly very ordinarily acted the way that Thucydides points out that they acted, or leads us to believe they acted in the debate that led to the expedition to Sicily, it's very hard to see how Athens would have lasted for more than 20 minutes, to go back to the early point. So I think that one of the things that we should be recognizing is that Thucydides, as a critic of democracy, at least as I imagine him as being, not an enemy of democracy, not someone who says, I just hate it, I want to destroy it, I despise it. He's not pseudo-Xenophon, it's not the old oligarch, but I think he's a profound critic of it. Does pick and choose, and he gives us examples of how democracy indeed can go wrong, how an emotional cascade can lead to a consensus, or at least a pseudo-consensus, since objectors, he tells us, were simply shut up or were afraid to speak. How this can, in fact, take place, and with deleterious effects. So a couple of things to say about this. It can't always have been the way, even in the 5th century, that it worked, because Athens simply, I think, couldn't have become an effective polis, run a big empire, fought a war for 27 years, had they been acting that way every time. It would only be accidental that they ever aligned, fell upon a policy that was more effective than less. But furthermore, the Athenians clearly did learn from mistakes, sort of, as it were, structural errors that were there in the earlier form of democracy, and that in the later years of the Peloponnesian War, and then after the loss in the war, they did reorganize certain parts of their institutional system in order to try to address this danger of, as it were, speakers who can really excite the demos in a way that was unwholesome, and that's in the end lead to these kind of emotional cascades and bad outcomes. So they do, and we could run through some of these, but the bottom line is the Athenians make more of a distinction between fundamental rules, they might call constitutional rules, and then the day-to-day policy that is set by the assembly. And they require that the policy is set by the assembly is in accordance with the basic rules that are meant to, as it were, instantiate the fundamental values, commitments of the demos over time in a non-excited state, as it were. And so they make it easier to challenge a speaker who is pushing towards a result that looks likely to be problematic, and do that in a legal way. And they begin to really press on this idea, and this may be partly in response to issues raised by critics of the democracy. They push on this idea of what is really the character or the virtue of a good citizen. And a good citizen is, get this quite a lot in the orators, is in some ways moderate. The good citizen moderates the tendency to go for just what you want at a given moment. That the good citizen recognizes that there is a common good, there is a good that is common to the community that has to take preference over some short-term desires of the individual, and that the good citizen listens in good faith to his fellow citizens, treats them in, this is Aristotle's language now, as civic friends rather than civic enemies. Civic friends doesn't mean you're all in love with each other and all chummy and you all want to go out to a beer after the assembly and everybody loves everybody. It's not that kind of friendship, but it's a kind of friendship that recognizes that I'm engaged in a ongoing relationship with my fellow citizens that is to some extent transactional, but is also aimed at setting and sustaining the baseline conditions of our continued conjoint flourishing. And so I think that notion that we the citizens needed, we the Athenian citizens needed to both tweak the institutions in order to lower incentives by ambitious elites to get everybody running in the same direction, even if it maybe isn't a very good direction. And we needed to emphasize the basic virtues of the citizen, or at least this basic core virtue of a kind of moderation in respect to individual or subgroup preferences.
All right, so last question, because I know you have an important football game to get to. Just very quickly, if I can get your view on this. I know John Haidt, who's a pretty level-headed guy, has said he started to worry about the health of democracy. Is that something that seriously worries you? I mean, you've spent your life looking at the history of democracy. Are we going to come apart at the seams? It sometimes seems, especially in the States, things are going a bit wild, or are we going to be all right?
Yeah, I wish I had a neat answer to that. No, it's fine, James. I've thought it through. We're going to be all right. But if I could say that with assurance, I would be a very much easier in my mind than I am. I think it really does. I think going back to what I was just saying about the Athenians, it really, I think, does depend on the question of whether we, a given democratic society, can recognize that there are institutional problems that need to be corrected through institutional fixes, and do the work to do that. And perhaps even more challenging, that we can recognize that the impulse to feed our own strongest partisan preferences and desires and emotions, which clearly there's lots of ways in which that happens through social media and other ways. If we don't find a way to, as it were, re-embrace some kind of conception of the virtue of the citizen as being moderate instead of the virtue of the citizen as being as extreme as possible, then I think we are in trouble. Now, is that something that's going to happen or not? I like to think that democracy can be self-correcting. When the pendulum swings really far in one direction, I think that the collective wisdom of the community can assert itself and say, that's wrong, that those who want to take us there are wrong, and that the strong majority will is to move back towards something like a commitment to moderation. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I at least am willing to be optimistic enough to say that if we recognize that's what's needed, and if enough people are willing to say that is what's needed, and we're going to push towards that, and we're not simply going to fight fire with more fire, and extremism with more extremism, then I think then there is hope.
Great. I know you started, it's called the Stanford Civics Initiative, right?
Yes, that's right. Stanford Civics Initiative meant to basically say it is possible to have in a classroom, in a university, strongly contrasting views, to debate really important and deep questions of value by people who do not agree on value questions, and to do so respectfully and in a spirit of, Aristotelian civic friendship rather than enmity and a desire for victory and defeat of enemies. So that's the goal, and I simply hope that other people will start similar kinds of initiatives that aim at not eliminating difference of opinion and belief, because every democracy depends on a genuine range of opinion and belief, but rather exchange of ideas that is aimed at the achievement of something that we can, wherever we are on the political spectrum, recognize as a common interest in continuing on in a community that is reasonably secure, reasonably prosperous, and doesn't have some boss with a boot on our neck.
Right, and I mean, this is why I've joined Heterodox Academy too, which has similar aims. So I was going to say we live in hope, but actually, there are concrete things that we can do. So thanks very much, Josh, for coming on and for that wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, James. Always a joy talking with you, and look forward to next time we talk, either in this sort of forum or in one-on-one privately.